Greetings. What's up, everybody? Um, let's have a talk. Let's have a chat. I'm just gonna get right to it. So recently, I've come across a interesting narrative that's been going around the internet. It pertains to Winston Churchill and whether or not he's the chief villain of World War II. And I made a reaction video to a gentleman who went on the Tucker Carlson podcast and basically laid out his case for why he believes that Winston Churchill is the chief villain of World War II. A man by the name of Daryl Cooper, who I don't really know much about, to be honest with you. He does like a podcast with Jocko Wilkes, I think he was saying. He's not. I don't think he's not a historian. I don't believe. Not a professional historian. And neither am I. I'm an amateur historian myself. Um, but I am pretty well read on World War II history, um, a lot of military history. That's kind of my bag. I read a lot of books, documentaries, all that stuff. I mean, it's not hard to educate yourself on this subject if you know where to look. So I'm just gonna let you guys know I am not someone who is prone to just believing whatever I'm told, and that goes for whether it's a mainstream viewpoint or whether it's a conspiracy theory. And I do believe in my fair share of conspiracy theories. I'm not immune to that at all. Um, so I don't want y'all to think I'm just some shill or something. I'm not. I understand there's things that happen, some nefarious things that happen in the dark, in the shadows. And I don't believe that everything's all roses and rainbows. And that also goes for Winston Churchill. I know he's not roses and rainbows. I know he's not a saint. The problem is the argument saying that he's the chief villain for World War II is one that I find to be very flawed in nature. Um, so the, listen, it comes down to, um, for me, it comes down to how can you blame someone for something that happened when they weren't in power, um, to begin with, you know, the thing happened before said person was in power, right? So all the events that led to World War II happened before Winston Churchill became prime minister. Um, all the events, the appeasement, all that happened way before Winston Churchill. The responsibility for the war really lies at the feet of a few people, a few individuals, and it hurts my heart to throw this particular individual in there because I actually think he was a good man who had good intentions, uh, um, and really truly believed that Hitler was telling him the truth, and that's Neville Chamberlain, and also, the people that were in charge of, the prime minister in charge of France or whoever was in charge of France. I'm not sure. I can't remember who it was. But all these different countries, whoever their leaders were, the ones that dealt with Hitler at the Munich conference, they are responsible. Okay? A lot of the blame could be laid at their feet. You can make a strong case for that because they're the ones that allowed Hitler to take the territories that he took. Um, to They knew he was rearming. They knew he was building a military. He broke a lot of the uh, already broke, the Treaty of Versailles, completely just cast it aside, and they were well aware of this, and they just chose to turn the cheek because they didn't want another war. Ironically, um, I mean, we're generation after World War I, so understandably, they were afraid of the outbreak of another war. But ultimately, the real blame for World War II lies at the feet of Adolf Hitler. Okay. It's Adolf. He's the one that had the plans. He's the one that knew. He knew he was going to break the Treaty of Versailles. He knew he was going to rearm. They knew they were going to invade all these territories, take them over, and he knew that the possible consequence of all these actions was could be war. Now, he may have convinced himself that he wasn't sure that Britain and France were going to, fight him. He didn't know. He wasn't sure that they were going to honor their agreements to Belgium and all them. But at the same time, he was ready for it. But the main point here is I'm kind of rambling. But the main point is that Winston Churchill was not prime minister at the time of all this. He wasn't even in government at the time of all this. He was on the outside looking in at the time of all this. He had hardly any sway in the British cabinet during this time period. He just didn't. He fell out of favor. And so, uh, first and foremost, to blame him to me is akin to like blaming. To me, honestly, it's like blaming the driver of the car who stalled out. Uh, that was carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife that allowed Gravallo Princip to be able to walk up to the car and kill them. It's like blaming that guy because he didn't know how to drive. Like, you can't blame him. You have to blame the guy who pulled the trigger and ultimately decided to assassinate uh, the Archduke and his wife. Like, that's the guy who should have the blame. The guy who pulled the trigger, not the guy who was just happened to be there, wrong place, wrong time, or whatever. Who just existed. He just exists. In this case, Churchill just existed at this point in time. How can you blame him? I don't understand. So that's first and foremost. Let's just get that out of the way. The argument continues on this path where he talks about the Germans then go in to invade the East. They see the Soviets as their main threat, right? So they have to invade the East to subdue the Soviets and Stalin, and they're doing that preemptively, basically out of fear of what Stalin will do by cutting them off from their supplies and all that. Problem with that is that's just not what actually occurred. That's not even the reason why Germany invaded Russia at all. It wasn't out of fear. Matter of fact, it was the exact opposite. Like, they thought they could just wipe the floor with Russia. They weren't afraid of Russia. Their whole plan was to secure living space for the German people. That, I mean, is well documented stuff. I mean, Hitler planned this all out meticulously with his high command. I mean, this stuff is not. This is not hidden knowledge, people. Like, it just isn't. And this is where I get a little like I gotta calm myself because the stuff is not. This is not. This stuff is well documented. It's well documented from people who were there around the time, who were in the inner circle. You got all this, firsthand accounts. I mean, you name it. That's what was happening. It's not whatever this theory is trying to say about Germany's intentions. It's just false. It's a false narrative. So it goes on. They go on to talk about that after Hitler invaded Poland and they were successful in Poland, that Hitler had every intention to sue for peace with the British and the French. Now, at this point in time, Churchill is prime minister. The British will not accept peace proposals from Hitler. Either will the French. They declared war. Um, Now, once again, you have to understand at this point in time, Hitler has broken promise after promise after promise after promise. Why would they accept peace from someone who has clear intentions of waging an aggressive war? He lied. They're not going to trust him. Do you like? Why would they? Anything that this man says at this point is akin to toilet paper. Like it don't mean anything. Churchill also knew the kind of had an idea about the sheer, and I hate to use this term, but it's the only term that to me that fits the evil of the Nazi regime and the villainy of Hitler himself. So he could be suing for peace, but he's only doing it basically to protect his own neck at that point in time. He's just trying to buy himself time. He had no intention of working with them. I mean, he had some kind of delusions. His ideology is all over the place, but he did see the British as, kind of on the same level as the Aryans or whatever. He saw them as equals, whatever. Point is, he had plans to go into England and subjugate the people. And I mean, he had the same plans for England that he had for the rest of Europe and Russia. I mean, he did. This is all well documented stuff. So Churchill was right to deny this man any kind of peace, because any kind of peace, like I said, that Hitler wanted was not any kind of peace that the rest of the world should have been interested in. And that's just a fact. I mean, come on. So we go on to talk about they go on to talk about some other stuff, but in doing so, he kind of glosses over this whole theory glosses over the whole you know the atrocities that the Germans were committing in Poland at the time. So if we're trying to weigh out who's a villain on the villain scale, the things that the Nazi regime were partaking in Poland at the time pretty much tipped those scales pretty far in their favor for being the chief villains. Um, Includes rounding up Jews, political dissidents, um, the intelligentsia of Poland, rounding them up, sometimes executing them on the spot, otherwise sending them to mass ghettos and yeah, for resettlement. But basically, we all know how that ended. The Poland was crushed, and most of it was crimes against humanity. And yeah, so chief villains, I think Adolf's got that on lock just after Poland alone. But to be fair, let's keep going. After Germany traps the British army at Dunkirk and the British army manages to escape, he proceeds to steamroll his way through the rest of Europe and eventually defeats France. They subjugate, they turn France into a puppet state, basically. And that's that, right? Now, they say in this theory that should have been the end of World War II. British should have sued for peace because they have no way to fight anymore. They should have just gave up. Clearly, they had no way to fight. Their army was reeling. They had to leave all their equipment on the beaches of Dunkirk. And so what would be the point? If Churchill was a good man, he would have just conceded defeat to Hitler and allowed Hitler to have whatever he wanted and to do whatever he wanted in France and in England. Right? Because that seems to be what they're getting at. And I'm sorry, I'm not stupid, but I know that's what they're getting at. The problem is, like I said, is that if you're going to have peace with Adolf, it wasn't going to be a peace that you could trust, and it wasn't going to be a peace that was going to be beneficial for your people. Therefore, why, as a leader of a country, would you surrender other than maybe to protect the lives of the rest of your soldiers who are going to have to fight and die? Okay, if you want to say that Churchill's a villain because he was willing to sacrifice the lives of his men to continue the fight that was lost, even though ultimately they won, we can't forget the result. Then, okay, fine. He's a bad guy. But just so you guys know, they had plans to send the SD into the UK and round up once again political dissidents, uh, the intelligentsia of the UK, everybody, and just execute them. They didn't have plans to just work in tandem, hand in hand with Churchill and the government of the UK. They didn't. Any notion of that? If you believe that, I'm not gonna knock you. Sure, maybe you have some reason to believe that Hitler was going, or Adolf was going to play nice with the UK, or I'm saying the UK, with Britain. It wasn't the UK at that time. With Britain, if you thought he was going to play nice with them, okay, fine, you can believe that. But just so you know, there's a lot of proof, a lot of evidence that says to the contrary of that. Why would you surrender to such tyranny? Now we get into something that, okay, I'll concede that it was bad that the Churchill engaged in, and that's the firebombing campaigns that the UK, saying the UK, I'm sorry, y'all, that that Britain, that the British engaged in, along with eventually the United States, the firebombing campaigns of civilian targets. I'm not gonna sit here and say that that was the up and up thing to do. Okay, they destroyed the city of Dresden, and countless numbers of civilians died. Whether or not it was a military target, no. I mean, the British can justify it any way they want, but it was probably on their part akin to war crimes. So their firebombing campaigns were awful and terrible. And Churchill, whatever, like you can say that because of that, he's evil, he's bad, fine. But once again, this is ignoring what the Germans were doing at the time. You see, they were bombing. They started out in fairness to them, which is funny. In fairness to the Germans, they started out bombing military installations, and they were trying to take out basically cripple the British ability to build fighter planes and all that. During their Battle of Britain, but they messed up and hit a civilian target that changed the course of things. Famously, the British retaliated. They sent bombers to Berlin, and then hit Adolf, changed his whole course, and they started bombing London. Now, they were killing civilians when that happened. The Germans were bombing London. They started sending eventually V2 rockets into the city. They were killing civilians with their bombing campaigns. They weren't at the same scale because they didn't have the capacity to do that. So it can't really compare, you know, and I guess in devastation to what the Allies did. But let's talk about, once again, they're still doing what they're doing in Poland, and it's escalating. And then they decide to invade Russia. And during their uh during Barbarossa, they were rounding up people and killing them. The Germans were. Now, You can blame Churchill for continuing the fight, and when maybe all odds were against him. You can blame Churchill for dragging the United States into the war, even though the United States was already a part of the war because they were sending weapons and munitions to the British long before Hitler declared war on the United States, long before Pearl Harbor. They were aiding in the war. You can say that Churchill coerced them into aiding in the war. Fine, whatever, if you want to believe that. But the war got worse. They say that he made it worse. Well, no. The war got worse when the Germans invaded Russia. That's when the atrocities and the scale of human carnage went up tenfold. It has nothing to do with what Churchill was doing or wasn't doing. It had everything to do with the Nazi dictators' plans for world conquest. So once again, I ask you, how can you say that Churchill's the chief villain, the reason why World War II got as bad as it did, when, as a matter of fact, the one who upped the ante was Adolf, was Germany. The numbers of dead in the Russian campaigns is astronomical, and I'm not even talking about what they were doing to undesirables, including the Jews. During their argument about this, he did use the word Zionist about Churchill. I'm not going to touch that. If you want to talk about that, feel free to do so. I just ask you keep it respectful and somewhat logical. But anyways, back to the point. There's just no way. They try to make an argument that Churchill was doing all this to make up for his failures at Gallipoli. And who knows? Maybe that was part of some of it, but it's just, I need people to understand that this war, probably more than most wars in recent history, was truly a war that needed to be fought and needed to be won by the Allies. I don't know what kind of world you envision living in if the Nazis would have won. But I just want you to understand that any world that they were going to create was probably, at least definitely for someone like me, not a world I was going to be able to live in. So, sure, Churchill drug the United States, he drug a bunch of other countries to continue the fight against Adolf and his tyrannical regime. But was it not necessary? Can you just think about it logically? Was it not necessary? That's all I got to say on this. Churchill is not the chief villain. The chief villain is Adolf. Um, I will say during the Nuremberg trials, when Hermann Goering was on the stand, he pointed out, hey, the Allied powers, you guys committed war crimes all over the place, and he talked about the firebombing and a bunch of other things, and they're right. He's right. I'm not saying that Churchill and the Allies were saints. I'm not saying that at all. They did plenty of terrible things. It's war. It's war. But the fact of the matter is, if you read up and you go through the Nuremberg trials, and not just the war crimes trials, but also the Nazi doctor trials, you realize that whatever the Allies were doing, you have what the Allies were doing, and then you have whatever the hell it was the Germans were doing. And if you really think about it, there's no comparison. There just isn't. There just isn't. Anyways, continue the discussion in the comments. Please keep it respectful. And if you want to add anything, like I said, please keep it logical. But anyways, like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed that. I just had to get that off my chest. Yeah, think about it. Keep the discussion going. Think about it. Anyways, I'll catch y'all next time. Till then, stay safe out there. Stay epic. I'm out of here.